I'm Bill Stegall, and I'm the pastor of the First United Methodist Church in Redding, California. I've just completed a 6-week study that I have been leading in this church about the thought of Alfred North Whitehead and process theology. The group that I've worked with has people in it with doctorates, bachelor's degrees, and no college at all. It has people who are younger, people who are older, some are conservative, some are liberal. It's a good mix of people to expose to Whitehead. Now, I have found in my experience in teaching process theology that it's important in the first session to give an overview of his thinking so that people get the big picture right at the start, and then we can work the next 5 weeks on more of the details. So this session that you're about to see on video is the first session. It's the big picture. People leave it somewhat confused, wondering what's going on. But then it gives me a chance in the next 5 weeks with study papers and a textbook, which is Process Theology, an Introductory Exposition by John Cobb and David Griffin. I use this along with the study papers with each of the 5 sessions to fine-tune what I have said in the first session. So you're about to see that first session, the overview, the big picture that I try to give the people the first time. I hope that you will find it enjoyable and helpful in some ways. Thank you. I'd like to welcome you to this session on the thought of Alfred North Whitehead and the process theology that has grown out of that. Process theology is very important to me and has been for about 25 years. And I like to share it with others. You get mixed emotions from people when they hear about it. Some people really like it, other people have trouble with it, and I feel very relaxed about the whole thing. I like to present it, and it is where I am, and if other people feel that they are not there, that's fine. That's their business. But one of the things I really do appreciate about Whitehead is that whatever you finally conclude about his thinking, he does push you to think through where you are in your own life and what your understanding of God is. It really does make you do some serious thinking about the faith issue in a way that we don't do in the church very often. It's part of my frustration that too often we don't have serious discussions about God and how God works. And this is a chance to do that. And I think that's an important kind of thing for us to periodically address. Let me discuss part of the problem I feel that we're in as in the world today as we ponder God. Copernicus, who was born in 1473, made the conclusion that the sun is at the center of the solar system and not the earth. And Galileo came behind him and reaffirmed that position. The Catholic Church strongly opposed that discovery because it was threatening in the sense that humankind was no longer the center of things. The sun was in the center instead of the earth. So there was a threat to that. In fact, an inquisition in 1632 was moved against Galileo, and he was tortured for his position. Protestants agreed with the Roman Catholics in this stance. It was one of those few times in the early history of Protestantism that they agreed with Rome. Newton came along in 1642, and he discovered natural law, the way natural laws work, and that raised the question, well, what does God do? If natural laws seem to make everything function, what's the role of God? So the church's answer was what became known as deism, that God is like a clockmaker, and he originally started the whole thing, and then it goes sort of on its own. And it's been pointed out to me that that's why in the West a lot of churches have clocks in them. And in the Eastern Christendom there are no clocks in the towers. But in the West, that idea that God was the clockmaker who started it all, the clocks in the towers sort of pointed to that reality. So then comes Darwin. And Darwin says you don't even need the clockmaker to start the process. Evolution takes care of the whole thing, and you don't need to explain God. Now, Darwin had some mixed emotions about that nature, the question of God. But clearly, a lot of evolutionists picked up on that there was no room for God, that you didn't need the clockmaker at the start. And then finally Freud came along and basically said that, that faith in a God is an escape in the first place, or in the last place. So you have all these forces that have been pounding on faith for the last 400 years. That the earth is not the center, it's the sun that's the center, so humankind is off here on one planet going around the sun. That natural law takes care of everything, and God is the clockmaker maybe at the start. Then along comes Darwin, you don't need a clockmaker. Evolution did it all. And then Freud comes along and says the whole thing's an escape anyway. And these people had a profound effect on all of our thinking. Out of that has come a deep confusion about what God does. If there is a God, what does God do? I mean, what's left to do? It all seems to be taken care of. The reaction of many conservative churches is simply to throw out modern science and go back and simply reaffirm a period before evolution was even thought of. The creationist stuff you often hear nowadays, a lot of people advocating they ought to teach it in the schools about Adam and Eve, and leaving evolution out of it completely. So that's one approach, is simply to leave the modern world and go back to a time when it was clear what God does. I don't find that a comfortable position. How can we leave it? It's here. The evidence is abundant of evolution. It feels to me like we have to deal with the world we have and not run from it. So in the more liberal churches, there have been various efforts to think through how God does function. One of the key ways in the 20th century is what some people have called the double perspective. That is, everything is determined by natural law, but nevertheless, it is God in the midst of the process making it happen, which is ambiguous. What does that mean? Everything is by natural law, but at another level, it's of God. It's not clear what that means, and it has left a lot of people profoundly unsatisfied or dissatisfied with the faith issue. Whitehead is the one person that I have felt in my own studies who came along with a stance that does express what God does in the world in a way that makes sense. And that's why I appreciate him so much. Let me say a few words about Whitehead. His life was in 3 volumes, basically. He was born, or early years were mainly in Cambridge, in England. Then he was in London at the University of London as a professor. And then he came to Cambridge, Massachusetts to teach at Harvard in philosophy. He was born in a parsonage in the Narrow Seas. His father was an Episcopal vicar. Born in 1861, he went to a private school as he was growing up that was 1,200 years old. Can you imagine that? It's for Americans. That's so hard to grasp that stuff. Besides being a whiz in mathematics, he studied Latin and Greek, history and poetry, so that he became a very comprehensive person in his understanding of science and literature as well. Did a lot of reading in theology for a number of years. Became a professor at Cambridge University, and married in December of 1890. Lived in Cambridge for 20 years. Was very active in the life of that community. Had 2 sons and 1 daughter. One of his sons was killed in World War I, and he felt a lot of agony about that the rest of his life. In the early part of the century, he wrote with Bertrand Russell, a famous philosopher, a book called Principia Mathematica, which was a major study of mathematics. He became president of the Senate of the University of London while he was there. In 1924, he was invited to Harvard University in America. He was 63 years old, and his greatest productivity was ahead of him and not behind him. It's important to remember. At 63, his greatest productivity was still ahead. He came over here and he taught philosophy at Harvard and had a profound effect in that school. His presence, his knowledge, the things he was doing. In 1929, he wrote the book. Well, before that, in the 20s and 30s, he wrote a number of books. One of them, for example, is this Adventures of Ideas, which was a prominent book that he wrote in that period. But in 1929, he gave the Gifford Lectures in England, and when you give those lectures, it's then put in book form. And the book came out, Process and Reality, and that's a picture of Alfred North Whitehead on the cover. This has got to be one of the most difficult books in the Western world. I took an entire year at a seminar in Berkeley Baptist Divinity School when I was a minister in Oakland, and for the entire year, all we did was study this one book, and then we didn't get through it. It was an extremely difficult book. I'll pass it around. You can get a glance at it and get a look at Whitehead. The book did not take off right away for understandable reasons because of its great difficulty, but slowly it did begin to have some impact. Whitehead himself often entertained people, Whitehead and his wife, at their home. And this book, you may have seen it sometimes in a bookstore. It's called Dialogues with Alfred North Whitehead. And it's happenings that happened in his living room when students and scholars would come and they'd spend the evening talking about the world, philosophy, religion, science, the whole works. He died on December 30th, 1947, at the age of 87. I wanted to read you at the end of this. The author says, he lingered 4 days, but without regaining consciousness after having a stroke. He died on December 30th, 47. And then he uses a quote from ancient Greece to sum it up. Such was the end of our friend, concerning whom I may truly say that of all the men of his time whom I have known, he was the wisest and justest and best, was the opinion of the man who put the book together. Let's see, I lost one of my papers here. Slowly his influence did begin to spread. Charles Malik, for example, who became the president of the General Assembly of the United Nations, was from Lebanon, wrote his doctoral dissertation for Whitehead in 1937. In the late 20s, actually, Reinhold Niebuhr, one of the great Protestant thinkers in American history, was talking about Whitehead, even in the late 20s, which was early for that to be happening. He included some of his thought in some of his books, in some of Niebuhr's books. One of the real breakthroughs was Charles Hartshorn, one of the great philosophers in America, who became very enamored of Whitehead and incorporated many of Whitehead's thoughts into his own philosophical system. And Hartshorn taught for many decades at the University of Chicago. And out of his teaching, a number of Whiteheadian scholars emerged. One of the primary ones was John Cobb, who is a Methodist theologian, and for many years, the theologian at the School of Theology in Claremont. He's now retired from there, but still teaching some at the Claremont Graduate School, and I think some at the seminary part-time. Through the years, he has written a number of books on process theology and Whitehead's thought, and has helped, along with some other scholars around America, to make Whitehead more and more prevalent, so that increasingly in the mainline seminaries, there are professors who are talking from a Whiteheadian perspective and urging their students to pay attention to that. So it has been gaining considerable ground in recent years. John Cobb, as I say, has been at the seminary since the late 50s. While he's been there, they created the Center for Process Studies at the school, and that's the group that is sponsoring the taping tonight. And that center helps prepare materials to be used in the churches on Whitehead's thought. It also brings together scholars from all over the world, Buddhist scholars, Hindu scholars, scientists, sociologists, politicians, come together to talk within the context of Whitehead's understanding of the world. And it's really exciting kind of a thing. When I was in seminary, I took a course or two from John Cobb, but I didn't deal directly with Whitehead, and it was other kinds of courses. I then went on to a church in Stockton, California, and it was in a poverty area, and I dealt with a lot of problems in that area, and a lot of human problems and tragedy and violence. And very quickly, my notion of God began to break down. I couldn't figure out what God was doing in the midst of that terribly troubled situation. I couldn't think through conceptually what the role of God was in all this. I understood that God is love and so forth, but I couldn't get a handle on what he does, what God does. Partly the result of what's happened with all these people like Darwin and Newton and Galileo and so forth, and the confusion they helped create among people of religion. It was at that point that I turned to Whitehead in a serious way and began studying him and corresponding with John Cobb, and he'd write long letters. I think he must have gotten awfully tired of it, but to help me along, because I was on the job trying to pick this up, and increasingly found Whitehead helpful for myself. Whitehead said at one point that religion should illuminate reality, not confound it, not confuse it. And I find that a terribly important statement, and the reason I gravitated to Whitehead. So much of what I hear in religion confuses reality for me. I can't make any sense out of it. Instead of clarifying it for me, I'm talking personally. And I find that Whitehead's thought makes reality make sense in a way that most religious talk I grew up on does not satisfy me, does not help me. Whitehead's thought helped me to understand the role of God in South Stockton as I struggled with it. So that's why I really do like to share it, because I have found that it was just extremely important for me. But again, I have to say that you may react in a negative way, you may react positively, and that's okay whichever way you need to go. But I think one thing that you will find as you pursue this is it will push you to think through where you are. If you're not with Whitehead, then where are you? And that's an important step, because we all probably need to do more thinking about our faith than we do in terms of what God's about. Tonight I want to do the overview, and then the next 5 weeks it's fine-tuning it, which is using the book by John Cobb and David Griffin called Process Theology, an introductory exposition, and we'll be using this, and I'll have some study papers too. So don't expect to pick it all up tonight. It will go in cycles as we keep going back over it. And I say that because Whitehead requires of you that you sort of think of the universe in different categories than you've been doing. He took modern science very seriously. That's part of why I appreciate the man. He was very serious about modern science and at the same time what God is doing. And too often we have thought about what God's doing and left science out of it, and that's where a lot of confusion gets created for people. So we will be looking at it, and it will take time, and we'll keep going back over it. Now, I'd like you to take out the long sheet, if you will, called Guide to Alfred North Whitehead's Understanding of God and the Universe. I prepared this chart, and you have the diagram or the small chart in front of you, to try to help explain this. And I will come back to this again and again in the next few weeks. So if you do not pick it up now, there will be additional opportunities, I assure you. Each one of these columns is what I call a millisecond, or a thousandth of a second. It could be much shorter than that, but that's about as much as our little brains will ever get around, so we'll settle for that. It means very quick, is basically what it means. At the top is God, and if you've ever wondered what God looks like, don't depend on my drawing to give you an answer, but that's God. These are what Whitehead called eternal objects. What they mean is new possibilities, that God entertains these eternal objects in God's own mind in the midst of creation. Now, let me read you, and follow with me on the long sheet, a number of these points, and then I'll stop, go back, and work it through this chart to try to make some sense of it. Number one, all reality is energy. All reality is energy, being composed of a complex combination of energy events. There is no such thing as spiritual matter versus physical matter. God and our spirits are both physical events. Energy events, just as is everything else that is. Two, The building blocks of the universe are electrical bursts of energy, each coming into being and fading away in a split second. Whitehead called them energy events, or actual occasions of experience. He interchanged those words. I usually say energy event. It's shorter. Point A, each energy event has a physical pole and a mental pole. Now, he didn't mean it's a little round globe and it's like a North Pole and the South Pole. It's a way of speaking about its function. The physical pole is that aspect of it which is purely a repeat of the past. The mental pole is an element of subjectivity and therefore of limited but genuine freedom that enables the energy event in the process of becoming to have some determination over the shape it will take and to receive new possibilities from God, the initial aim, which I'll explain later. B, rocks, water, flesh, air are all incredibly complex combinations of these energy events, or what Whitehead would call societies of occasions. They come together into societies. C, God and our spirits or souls are each a series of these energy events that are highly developed in complexity, especially in regard to the mental pole. Number 3, process is the becoming or taking shape of energy events and is determined by 3 factors. A, past energy events, which is cause and effect, influence present energy events at the physical pole as they take shape. B, God, through the giving of the initial aim, influences the shaping of present energy events at the mental pole, which is the pole that receives and considers novelty. C, the subjectivity and therefore freedom or partial self-determination of the mental pole of energy events in the process of becoming significantly affects the shape these events take. The result of these 3 factors is the emergence of the subjective aim or guiding principle of the energy event, which finally determines how the energy event in the process of becoming shall shape itself. 4, God's role in this continuing creation lies in God's giving of the initial aim to each energy event as it begins to create itself. The initial aim is a series of eternal objects or possibilities presented in graded relevance from the ideal at that moment downward. God offers novelty and also limits, thus making growing complexity possible. The ideal is that possibility for this energy event at this moment that will lead it, and reality as a whole, to greater complexity and intensity of feeling, which Whitehead defines as beauty or enjoyment. God is the one who calls, the energy event who calls all other energy events forward to greater complexity or beauty. Now, that sounds all very confusing, right? And incidentally, stop me at any point, ask a question as we go along on this. Let me work it through this chart now. Whitehead is saying that the entire universe is composed of bursts of energy, including our souls, our bodies, this floor, this table, everything. It's rapid-fire successions of energy events. This is an energy event that is completed. It has what Whitehead called objective immortality. It's gone, except its influence lingers. That is, whenever we do something, we send out, cause and effect. It keeps affecting things on out beyond us. So this event is done, but its influence goes forward to the next second or millisecond or whatever. Here's another energy event that's completed and another one. They're just there for the drawing. Now, in the new millisecond, a new energy event comes into existence. I mean, all over the place, but we're just looking at one to get a sense of it. As this energy event begins to take shape, and the broken line implies that it's not, it's just coming into existence, it's not dead yet, not objectively immortal. There are 3 factors that determine what happens to this energy event. God's initial aim that comes in from God. Here's the initial aim coming down. Whitehead called what God wills for that energy event as it takes shape is the initial aim. and it comes from these various possibilities of God for the future. So God feeds in a possibility to this energy event. It is also influenced by the past energy events, all of them. They're all feeding in. So it feels, prehends, in Whitehead's term, the past around it, just as we always do. We're always influenced by the past at every minute. In addition, there is a third factor, and this is where it gets a little bit on the radical side, that every energy event has a slight degree, at least, of subjectivity, subjective immediacy, or mentality, or freedom. That every energy event has a slight, it doesn't mean that all energy events have brains. He did feel that our own I-ness is an energy event, and that we do have a powerful ability to think. But that most energy events are much more primitive than that. But even the most primitive energy that makes up this table has a slight degree of subjectivity or freedom to do its own thing. And there is evidence in modern science of that, because, as you know, they can predict the behavior of electrons, for example, in vast numbers, but they cannot absolutely predict the behavior of an individual electron. It may go off and do its own thing a little bit. There is some freedom. It's part of the new physics that has been discovered in the 20th century. There is some freedom at this level of subatomic particles. And Whitehead was saying in the 20s that his understanding of why that freedom is because there is a slight degree of subjectivity for the energy event to decide what will happen to it. It then takes shape on the basis of these factors altogether. The energy event considers, so to speak, God's influence, the influence of the past, and takes its final shape here. And this is an energy event that's completed. Notice there's an arrow that goes up, which means that as it takes shape, it influences God as well. God is influenced by the world, in other words. It isn't that just God influences us, but as the energy takes shape, it also influences God, enriches God, leads God to new possibilities for what God is doing with creation. Then here, this energy event, like this one over here, has now reached objective immortality. It now sends influence to the next energy event that's taking shape. And again, God feeds in an ideal possibility, what God wishes that energy event would do. This past one and others around it feed in their influence from the past, and then the energy event has a slight degree of freedom or mentality to decide what it will do with itself. Now, Whitehead's argument was that that is the way the whole universe is functioning. Now, do you see that the thing that for me was a breakthrough when I first discovered it? In Whitehead's understanding, as he pondered science and pondered the modern world and how the universe functions, his understanding of God's role is right here. That God isn't a clockmaker who wound it up and then backs off, or isn't irrelevant because evolution takes care of it all, though Whitehead strongly believed that evolution is a real thing, but that in every single split second, with every energy event in the universe, God is feeding in what God hopes that energy event will do. So that God is intimately involved at every moment in the creation, the whole creation, in all of us. One of the things that's fascinating is that some people have felt that Whitehead process theology is very liberal and radical, and it's got a radical edge to it in some ways, and therefore not faithful to the church. But one of the things that I've appreciated about Whitehead is that in his own way, he comes back to affirming some of the great claims of the church, such as that God is involved in life, isn't detached, but is involved, does have a concrete will for us. And that's what Whitehead is clearly saying, that God has a will for every energy event at every moment, what he wishes it would do. And what the overall pattern behind God's work, in Whitehead's understanding, is enjoyment. that God is seeking to create more and more enjoyment in the universe. He sometimes used the word beauty, that God is trying to create more beauty, more intensity of experience from just random energy events floating around. God keeps trying to create more and more experiences of intensity. For instance, our brain is a good example. It's a crowning achievement, so far at least, in the whole process of what God's about, leading us to an ability to profoundly experience reality. And that's the kind of thing God's moving forward with all the time in Whitehead's thinking. Now, do you have some questions, some confusions, whatever? Let's talk about this for a few moments. Anyone have anything?
This indicates free will, I think.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. That we do have freedom. That's another one of these basic claims, at least a part of the church in history, that Whitehead undergirds, that we do really have freedom.
Talking about, like in millisecond 2 you got there, you got the event that's about to happen. Did it begin to happen because of past events and because of God's influence, or how did it begin?
Yeah, energy continues to move forward in creation. And this energy comes out of this. As it dies, it gives birth to new energy. It just keeps moving on. Incidentally, Whitehead believed that there never was a beginning of creation. Now, that may trouble you, and we have been taught a lot that creation came from nothing, though if you'll look at Genesis chapter 1, it does talk like there is a substance out there that God began to manipulate. It doesn't talk about nothing. It talks about sort of a void out there with something. If that concept that there is no beginning is troublesome to you, try to think of the other one, that there was a beginning. In either case, it transcends our limited understanding to add it up. But Whitehead felt this has always been the case, that there has been energy and there has been God working with energy, trying to move it toward greater complexity, greater experience, greater beauty. That's what God is about.
Bill?
Yes?
Is it appropriate to think of that as an illustration of throwing a rock in the pond, and then the ripple goes out in number 2, and then number 3, sometimes all those ripples are not even. Some of them will, one will be go out in its own way.
Yeah, the question is it appropriate to think of it, for instance, of a rock thrown in water and the ripples going out? In some ways it is, that this energy event keeps sending influence out to the next one, which sends it out to the next one, which sends it out to the next one in some modified form. But the cause and effect keeps working all the way along. Incidentally, when you mentioned freedom of the will, one of the things that when I was in college, you used to get these long arguments about do we have freedom or do we not. It's a typical college argument. And one of the reasons people often think we don't have freedom is because they tend to see the past as flowing through us in a continuous stream that you can't get away from, that the past just completely determines us. But Whitehead, you see, doesn't have a continual stream. There is a break constantly between every energy event and the next energy event. And that's where the free possibility of freedom is, between each one. In other words, his view of reality is a little bit like a motion picture film, where you have separate scenes, separate, what's the word I'm thinking of? Frames. And then you run them fast, and it looks like one continuous flow, but it really isn't. There's a break between every one. Whitehead said that's the way reality works. It is always the breaks. And in between the events, every time, you see, the next energy event has some freedom to decide what it's going to do. And that allows for the kind of freedom that we're talking about, that often in college kids never see because they keep wanting to argue like it's a steady stream, the past, and you can't get out of it. It traps you. Jim?
Well, it appears to me that not only do you have, according to Whitehead, you have freedom of thought in combination with past events. And the net result of that is an element of unpredictability to what God started in the first place.
Yeah.
Does that conflict with the concept of, is there really a concept of omniscience in the Bible in terms of how?
Yeah, there are some passages that basically say that. Whitehead did not believe that God knows the future, that he felt the future is open. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. When I first taught this in Oakland once, I had a member of the church in the class, and the next morning she called me, and she said, I laid awake all night worrying about that after I said it. It comes as a shock sometimes because we've grown up thinking God knows everything that's coming, which finally is a form of predestination if it's already known what's going to happen. And Whitehead did not accept that we do not know, because freedom permeates all reality. We do not know what tomorrow is going to bring. And God does not know either. Now, God has statistical probability because God is in touch with all the energy in the universe. So he can sense more than we can, obviously, where its direction seems to be. But even God cannot be certain because there is this freedom. Let me push on because we're getting into the rest of this paper and I need to get it all on the table so we can see the whole thing. Number 5, near the bottom, God never creates alone. Past energy events, cause and effect, and the subjectivity or freedom of present energy events in the process of becoming also affect the shape reality is taking. 6, therefore, God is limited. And I want to talk about that word a little while. That word is a mixed bag. Having to work with what is given and unable to exclusively determine the outcome at any given moment. God is the supreme, but not the exclusive factor influencing the process or forward movement of reality. A, this is not a limitation God has chosen to place upon God's self in order to allow us to have some freedom. B, God's limitation and our freedom are simply givens in the process of reality that neither God nor we ask for, but in fact find to be inherent in our situation. You see what he's saying? That since always there has been energy, God is the supreme example, working with the rest of energy, and maybe in other cosmic epics besides this one and before this one that we're part of, since that's always the case, the freedom is not a gift of God to the rest of energy. Freedom is inherent in every energy event in the universe. And it is something that God must deal with. It is not something that God gave. Now, God in this creation is multiplying the freedom, obviously. We have tremendous freedom in our souls, which Whitehead again understood as an energy event, much more freedom than the energy here in this table. If God has been leading that process of evolution to bring about our brains and our souls, then clearly God is on the side of even increasing the freedom greater. But from the beginning, in Whitehead's understanding, freedom is inherent in creation. It is not a gift of God. And God has to deal with it. Now, that's one of the places where some people decide to part company with Whitehead, because that's a fairly radical notion that's not part of our usual thought pattern. Now, let me push on. Number 7, consequently, God has no master plan that is slowly but surely being put into effect. The future is genuinely open, and neither God nor we nor anything else can know with definiteness what tomorrow will be like. But God, nevertheless, is always at work seeking to create greater beauty. Now, that runs against the grain of a lot of people, of course, because you'll hear constantly about God's plan and how basically it's all worked out and it always comes out the way God wants it, and all of those kind of things, which in South Stockton began to collapse for me as I saw the kind of tragedy around me. Are you kidding? This is God's plan? And that's part of why Whitehead spoke to me. May not speak to you on that point. but that the future is genuinely open, and we cannot be sure which way it will go. It follows, number 8, from the above points that God has a circumstantial will. I'm playing off of a little book by Leslie Weatherhead that some of you are familiar with called The Will of God, and he uses that term. Whitehead drives it much deeper, but that's the same term as Weatherhead used to use. God has a circumstantial will. That is, God must constantly readjust God's will to meet the changing circumstances of the rest of reality, seeking at every moment to influence through the initial aim, that is, this signal, if you will, from God down to the energy, seeking to readjust, I lost myself, where was I here? Through the initial aim, energy events to choose options that will lead reality toward greater beauty. So, in other words, God, and Whitehead felt God does have a direction God's moving in, and that is trying to create greater beauty. Intensity of experience. I mean, it's clear where God wants to go with it. The whole process of evolution is in that direction, toward greater complexity and beauty and intensity of experience. But that along the way, God can be defied and may at times have to adjust to realities God did not want in order to move us forward. I find that helpful in my own personal faith when I see something like Bosnia, the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, to understand that God did not have total control. I mean, how do you fit that? If God is in complete control, what do you do with the Holocaust? Whitehead would say, well, God isn't in complete control in the first place. I mean, there is a freedom that's inherent in reality that gave the Nazis considerable room to move, and they did, unfortunately. We'll keep coming back to that. Number 8b, in God, the physical pole is that aspect of God that is continually affected and influenced by the world. Remember, I said every energy event has a physical side, that is, it's influenced by the past. And that's where this event, as it takes shape, influences God. So God is always being influenced by what's happening in the world around us.
Is it being
changed? Enriched, wider possibilities that open up for God in terms of creativity. Not changed in terms of love. Whitehead felt strongly that principle is a very part of God's being. But in terms of interaction with reality around God, there are changes constantly happening which force God to change plans, move in new ways, call energy in new directions, all those kind of things.
Kind of like being newly elected president. He has to constantly readjust to what he said last week.
Hopefully not that quickly, as it's been going on lately. Yes, good point. Number C, God's mental pole is that aspect dealing with novel possibilities. God's circumstantial will arises out of God's mental pole, and is circumstantial because God's physical pole is constantly being modified by the world, thus affecting God's decisions as to which possibilities are relevant at any given moment and place. So that God is adjusting as creation moves forward to the changes that happen, often that God does not wish and must deal with. God had to adjust what God was hoping for in the world when Hitler took over Nazi Germany in this thinking. Hitler was not the will of God. Hitler was a defiance of what God was about, and God had to adjust to deal with the world in the midst of a Hitler and all he represented.
In my mind, I see that as part of God's freedom. That he did not interfere because he gave Hitler the same rights he gave everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
He gave us the freedom to make choices, good or bad, and he doesn't always interfere intercede as much as freedom.
That's a good point. I'm glad you raised it, Audrey. That is, has been, right along in this century, one of the main approaches of the liberal wing of the Protestant Church, and I basically grew up with that understanding myself, and a lot of very respected thinkers hold to that view. It is still a very main point with a lot of Christian thinkers that what's happened is that God pulls back or holds back God's power to allow us freedom to develop. And in the midst of that, some terrible things can happen because God allows the freedom. That is the dominant Protestant position, I would think, today. Process theologians argue, on the other hand, that if God has all the power, is all-powerful, which this position does imply, that he gives power to us, but finally God has the monopoly on the power, that God could have done it differently so that we would still have developed profoundly in our maturity, but not with all the carnage. That the 20th century has been so terrible that to say that God, now this is one view, and others would strongly differ with it, but that the process theologians would say the 20th century has been so terrible that to say that God is simply pulled back to allow freedom is an unconscionable act on the part of God, to allow the kind of slaughter and heartbreak that we have seen in the 20th century. And that's where my position is now. But again, many respected Protestant leaders would still want to argue vigorously that God does have the freedom to do what God wishes, but has pulled back in order to allow us freedom. So yet that's one of those places where you have to make your decision, where it feels most real to you. Part of my problem in South Stockton was right around this, that, you know, in the midst of all the suffering I was witnessing, it just didn't feel like that idea that God had simply pulled back to allow us freedom. That didn't feel too good to me. And I began to feel restless with that understanding personally, and still do. So the Whiteheadian view would be that in the midst of the terrible carnage of the 20th century, that has, if you want to put it in human terms, broken God's heart. That God has been struggling to call us in another direction, and we have consistently defied God, and God cannot stop us from that defiance. We have the power to do that as individual energy events in our souls. At one point he said that God is the fellow sufferer who understands, which I find a very touching kind of a statement. God is the fellow sufferer who understands, because God suffers in this creation, trying to move it toward love. Yeah.
One of the things that I've always struggled with, it seems like there are two entirely separate gods between the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Uh-huh.
And it seems like in the Old Testament he didn't allow people to suffer for very long before God's wrath was visited upon them and things got set on a different course. But you're laying out a conceptual framework for, you know, a theological way of thought here. Does Whitehead ever try to relate it back to specific events in the Bible, or does he remain at this theological level?
He basically remained at the theological level. He did refer on a number of occasions, talk about Jesus, and argued that Jesus really embodied in the love he lived a God that was tender and not overwhelmingly powerful, and that the early church, in his words, the early church immediately started thinking of God as Caesar, because Caesar ruled Rome, instead of like Jesus. So that God once again became the all-powerful ruler, and that was not what Jesus was about. Jesus was exposed, vulnerable, they killed him, and that we immediately went back to Caesar. In fact, there are some quotes in one of your papers. I gave you some quotations from Alfred North Whitehead there somewhere, and one of them says that, some quotes from Alfred North Whitehead: "The life of Christ is not an exhibition of overruling power. Its glory lies in its absence of force. It has the decisiveness of a supreme idea." And in another point, he says that the problem, and the quotation is there somewhere, is that the early church again went back and took Caesar as the example of God instead of Jesus. So in that sense, he does grapple with the Scriptures considerably. The difference between the Old and New Testament God is not total, of course, because there are profound statements of God's love in the Old Testament. But there is that immediate reaction of God in the Old Testament, which is very strong and overwhelming at times. as he wipes out 50,000 people or so forth. Brian?
Does he have a way of fitting Jesus and the Holy Spirit into this communication between the energy events that we are and the energy events that God is in? How does Jesus and the Holy Spirit fit into this communication?
His whole understanding of creation is incarnational, where one incarnates or enters into the very substance of the other. And that's our theory, of course, the Christian history of Jesus, that God was incarnated in Jesus, that God somehow in a unique way was present within Jesus. And this whole view is incarnational, that God is constantly incarnating God's will into each energy event that's taking shape. So that in some way, writ large, God was doing that in Jesus. What God does to a limited degree in every event in the universe. Now, Whitehead did not get into complicated discussions about God's relationship to Jesus. Theologians since then in the Whiteheadian tradition have been working on that. We will pick up on that later in the book. There is a chapter on Jesus. But suffice it to say right now that Whitehead is clear that God does incarnate God's self into every event taking shape. And the church has historically said that supremely, most importantly, that's happened in Jesus. And this thought does open the possibility for some of that kind of thinking. The Holy Spirit would really probably, you could say, the initial aim, because that is God calling every energy event to its possibilities, to be moving into the energy event. And our understanding of the Holy Spirit has always been God in us. And that's what the initial aim is all about. So really that would be where the Spirit issue would come down. Let me move on a little bit more so we can get the whole paper before us. Number 9. Creation, including humankind, is never the absolute ideal from God's perspective, because God is often defied in the direction God desires energy events to take. Thus, reality at any given moment is simply the best possible situation from God's perspective, given the circumstances God has to work with. At any moment, it's not what God wanted in the ideal form. It's what God, the best that was possible given the circumstances God is working with. The energy out there that sometimes goes another direction. Number 10. The power of God is persuasion, calling energy events forward through the initial aim and not force. That the power of God is to persuade us rather than shove us, which in the Old Testament sometimes comes through very strongly, the shoving kind of thing. And because that persuasion has been able to bring forth this magnificent creation, it is evident that God has the necessary power to profoundly affect and shape the universe and to inspire awe and worship in us. Now, some people will say that a God that's not all-powerful is not worthy of our worship. And some people have rejected Whitehead on those grounds. That if God cannot shape it the way God wants, then God is not worthy to be worshipped. The process answer, which is the answer I would give, is that God is the supreme power, but not the only power, is powerful enough to have affected reality in the profound way we see around us. We're here because of the movement of God's Spirit, the initial aim, in calling energy forward through the eons of time. And any being that can do that, in my way of thinking, is worthy of worship. I mean, that is the supreme one, even though God may not be all-powerful. But there are many who will say, in Whitehead's thinking, that because God is not all-powerful, Whitehead's understanding of God is not worthy of our worship. The being is not worthy. Number 11, all energy events are subjects with some measure of control over their own destinies. And God and our spirits, as extremely complex energy events, are capable of self-consciousness and the emotions that accompany self-consciousness. In other words, every event, because it has this moment of mentality to it, very limited in a table, very high in our selfness, our soul, the I-ness in us, that in the moment of its existence, every energy event's a subject. Then it becomes an object, as it becomes objectively immortal, as it goes into the past. And that passage is also saying that in Whitehead's understanding, God is energy as well, an energy event, a series of rapid-fire bursts of energy, as well as we, that is what the creation is all about, is energy. There is nothing besides energy. And that our souls are energy as well.
Then there's no shape. It's just energy.
Well, but the energy, of course, the subatomic particles then come together in such a way that electrons, protons, and you start to get atoms and molecules that come together. And in this understanding, in the earliest times in the universe, God was calling all these energy events to move together toward the creation of electrons and protons and atoms, and to bring the atoms together in different ways to create the molecules, which then created more and more, and then you could build on this to bring forth the creation. So, you do have a substance, of course, but the substance is made of all these bursts of energy. And that is basically what modern science is saying. I mean, that's not a fairy tale. That is, in truth, what has been discovered. That while this is very hard and would hurt if it hits you in the head, it is made up of all these little bursts of energy. And Whitehead's simply saying that God is calling all of them. Now, in a low-grade object like a table, God is not calling that table to evolve into something else. Basically, God is calling that table, those energy events, to remain the same, to keep repeating the past. We have to have the solid stuff around us, at least it feels solid to us, even if it's all energy, to survive. But then, in some areas of creation, God calls some energy events to move forward in new ways, to create a future, which is the story of evolution and the story of life. Did I say anything, or did I just go past what you were saying?
No.
Okay, one never knows whether I'm saying anything or not. But, it is true in modern science that this is energy. This is not just a hard substance. Jim?
I'm just a little confused. Did you say, though, that the burst of energy created God, or the other way around?
No. God and energy have existed since the beginning. Neither created the other. I mean, it's all energy, and it's been from the beginning. There is no beginning, and there is no end. There may be an end, in Whitehead's thinking, to this universe we're a part of. I mean, there's a good chance of that. But there is no end to energy, and there is no end to God's movement through it in creating beauty. Yeah, Nora?
Other constellations.
In other constellations, yeah.
Are bursts of energy.
Yeah, that wherever there is anything in this universe, in this cosmic epic, as Whitehead would sometimes say, it is energy events.
But they're all the same God.
But they're all the same God. The same God is moving through all of it, the entire universe, influencing those events, calling those events forward, so forth. Were you going to say something,
I
Kelly?
was just trying to see if it would help me understand where we're headed. If I pictured, is God, are we trying to picture God as a separate force of energy that's influencing all these other
Yes.
bits of energy? Are we trying to picture all these bits of energy and God is in each one of them and they're all interreact?
Well, they're all interrelated.
Yeah.
There's a strong...
I'm having trouble with a separate force coming in here.
that they are all interrelated, but God is the supreme energy event of the universe and is entering into every one in a special way in Whitehead's thinking. Now, each energy event as it takes shape is influenced by all the past. So the other energy events are feeding into it. But then, in addition to all that, God submits what Whitehead called the initial aim of what God wishes that event would take and go with toward the future.
So we're still trying to perceive of God as a separate force.
That's right. Separate, but very much a part of everything, moving through everything. We will stop at that point and take a break. Nora Simpson raised an issue a little while ago. Give me an example of what I'm talking about, an energy event. let me use our own experience, because Whitehead thought that was a good way of doing it. Whitehead felt that the I-ness in me, our self-consciousness, I don't mean our embarrassment, our awareness of ourself, is a series of rapid-fire energy events in the region of our brain, which is also composed of energy events. But that our I-ness is a very complex energy event, very highly developed series of them in rapid fire. And if you think about it, there are these three influences that affect us split second by split second. On the one hand, there is the past that always influences who we are at any given moment and what we're thinking. What I'm thinking right now is affected by what I was thinking a minute ago and what my parents were thinking 50 years ago, and so on and so forth. In addition, God is influencing me. At least that's the stance of the church, and it's my own sense. And sometimes I grow dull and don't notice it. But it is our faith that God also has a will for me at this moment in terms of what I do with my life. But finally, I also have some freedom to decide what I'm going to do. I mean, I have to put it together myself finally in a package. And I can say no to God in some profound ways. I can't say no to the past. The past is there, though I can determine in some ways how I'm going to use the past and react to it. But if you just look inside, you can get a sense of what an energy event does. The past influences, God is moving into it, and the mentality, the slight mentality in many cases of the energy events helps it to shape itself, and that's what we're doing all the time in this energy event called our awareness or our selfhood or our soul. Those three factors are playing a role. Now, in the table, that's a very primitive level. In the soul, in the region of our brain, that's a very sophisticated level. But Whitehead would argue that all of that is still energy events that are happening. Let's push on this for a little while. Number 11. All energy events are subjects with some measure of control over their own destinies. And God and our spirits, as extremely complex energy events, are capable of self-consciousness and the emotions that accompany self-consciousness. 12. Process always has been, meaning there never was a start, a creation from nothing. And there is no final end to creation. It shall go on eternally. 13. Evolution is a proof of God, or at least at minimum a helpful doctrine. This is my own opinion I'm putting here. It documents the growing complexity and richness. This points to some power that has introduced novelty, the initial aim, and yet given limits. Now, these possibilities up here are novelty. Whitehead argued that something never comes from nothing. Something always comes from something. And where do new possibilities originate? And Whitehead said they originate with God, who feeds them in to creation, into all the rest of the energy of the universe, calling it to incorporate the novelty and move forward in greater beauty. And that basically is the story of evolution. I mean, that's what it's about. God constantly feeding in new possibilities through the initial aim, and energy sometimes responding positively, especially through the DNA code. Which we now understand, makes up who we are, and that as it mutates, new possibilities arise, and so on and so forth, and that God is influencing that kind of process. Now, there have been dead ends in evolution, and sometimes it goes in ways that are not healthy. And Whitehead's thought would be, that's not the will of God, but that is the inherent freedom in creation that can lead to some destructive things, as well as the creativity that God is trying to bring about as God calls reality forward. So, in my view, evolution really does help to document the work of God. Now, there are scientists, some scientists who would simply say that you still don't need God to call evolution. It can do it on its own. I find that a huge leap of faith or something to really believe that's true. And there are many other scientists who do feel that Whitehead had an important insight into what God is doing, that in feeding in these possibilities and in calling creation forward, and sometimes being frustrated and defeated in the process in certain areas. Anyway, number A, that evolution documents the growing complexity, the richness that God is calling forth. B, the fact that the trend of evolution is toward the incredible complexity of self-consciousness would seem logically to point toward a God who is also self-conscious and calling as much of physical reality as possible to join God at that level of richness. In other words, if the whole of creation, if evolution keeps moving toward greater consciousness with the development of the central nervous system up to where we are at this point with our sharp awareness when we decide to use it, that would suggest, at least to me, that the God who is calling energy in that direction must also have that kind of sharp self-consciousness, self-awareness, much more than we do, and is calling us forward in the direction of where God is. Not that we'll become little gods, though we sometimes already think we are, but that God is calling us toward that appreciation of the intensity around us that our brain, central nervous system, allows. And that says something about God's nature as well. And then number 14, there are grounds for hope because God is constantly at work, seeking to lead all reality toward a better tomorrow. But there is no room for sweeping optimism, for God's will can be frustrated by the events of the rest of physical reality. A lot of people, subconsciously at least, I think, live with the assumption that if things get too terrible, God will do something about it and stop the process. But the truth is, of course, that if we choose to destroy the planet with nuclear bombs, fortunately we backed off that to some degree now, we'll do it. And God will not be able to stop that process. As I have heard some people say, the cockroach would survive it. They survive everything. And God would start working with the cockroach, you know, and starting to move creation forward again. But it would be a long, hard process. But that God will always, because God loves and wants a creation to come and join him in the richness of experience, that God would be about that. Virginia.
Well, I was just wondering when you were talking about with God calling us further and to a higher and to him, where does that leave our theory of life after death and of our being to be with God after our own death? Or are we just a process of this of evolution that goes on to a higher evolution on this planet?
Whitehead did not take a stand on that issue. What he did say was that his understanding of reality did not preclude the possibility of life after death. And he left it there. The energy event that is our soul, or our I-ness in the region of our brain, might well be able to survive the deterioration of our brain. We already are aware that mental telepathy is real. There are communications that break away and go out into space to others. It suggests the possibility that we may not need our brain totally, and that the energy event that is the I-ness in us may well survive. Whitehead saw that that was a possibility. Now, some process theologians have emphasized that within our Christian faith, in terms of our understanding of life after death, that is something that needs to be affirmed. But Whitehead's point was that he did not preclude in his thought the possibility of life after death. If you look for a moment at some thoughts of God's power, some thoughts on God's power, it's this paper I put together, and Betty Moon was asking me a question about where it says I, is that Bill Stegall? And it is. This is my paper. But let me run through it in, not read all of it, but in condensed form, because it sums up what we've been saying. There are several ways to look at God's power. One is that God is all-powerful, that God has a monopoly on all the power, and that whatever happens is because God wants it to happen that way. That has been a strong strand in Christian thinking, that that's the way God is. Martin Luther basically came down there. And John Calvin in the whole doctrine of predestination, that it was all pre-planned what was going to unfold. There were nuances to their thought that were different, but essentially, and through all church history, there has been this notion that God has all the power, may share a little bit with us, but could take it back if God wished. And God can determine whatever's to happen. The danger in that view, and that view, incidentally, is very strong in many fundamentalist churches, And if you'll listen to some of the preachers on TV, that's the kind of God they're talking about, who has all the power. I find that a meaningless concept myself, but it's still very powerful among many, many Christians. The danger in the view is that it's deterministic. It makes God responsible for the shape of things today. It downplays our sense of freedom and responsibility. And when you hear some of the preachers who do this in extreme, it really does take away our freedom. God's calling the shots. The second approach is that God is all-powerful but has imposed limitations. This is what we were talking about a little while ago, Audrey. On God's self to allow for freedom. It has been a strong view in the liberal church in the 20th century. Its weakness for many people has been that in the midst of the carnage we have witnessed in this century, the feeling that if God really has all the power, then God could have done it differently, still allowed moral development, but not allowed the carnage. And that if God is really loving, then God should have done it with that kind of power. And that's a hotly debated issue. I'm just saying that that's the different views about it. The other main view has been, so one view is all-powerful. The other is all-powerful but pulls back some to allow us some freedom. The third view is God is not all-powerful, or at least God's power is very different than what we've usually conceived of it as. There have been various people who have articulated that view, but in the 20th century, the outstanding person to do that was Alfred Whitehead in the way he understands the work of God. And if you would look down there in number C, C2a, it starts that with his scientific background, he became convinced that the heart of all physical reality are bursts of energy in rapid-fire succession. And he felt these energy events have some degree of freedom or subjectivity. Obviously, the most simple ones, such as in a piece of wood, are not conscious. And yet he was convinced even the simplest energy event has a little bit of freedom to do its own thing. Science appears to have some evidence of this today, in the behavior of subatomic particles. And then point B there, Whitehead's conclusion, the universe is alive, or the universe has mentality all over the place, or subjective immediacy was another term he used to use for energy events and their experience. Freedom is built into the very structure. And this led him to the conclusion that God is not all-powerful in the way we have usually talked about power, but must deal with the freedom that is natural in all reality. The concept of evolution helps lend credence to this conclusion. The long, tedious process is probably the result. I mean, it took eons, the evolutionary process, to bring us to where we are today. It's probably the result of God's having to deal with the freedom, and therefore at times the resistance of energy events down through the eons, as God has patiently, persistently called them into new formations, or lured them. That's a word Whitehead used to like to use, lure. That God keeps luring, tempting energy to come forward in new ways, in creative ways. And that's the story of evolution, and it's taken a long, long time. Some people will say, well, but you know, a billion years are like a second in God's eyes. Well, I don't know about that. A billion years is a billion years. And why did it take a billion years? And this would be one perspective on it. Number C, God is still, in this view, the major power in the universe, but not the exclusive one. Each energy event, in the brief moment of its taking shape, is influenced by God. An incredible thought, that in every moment God sends a signal, God's will, to every energy event in the universe. But each event is also influenced by its own past and its freedom to help shape its split-second destiny. Thus, God, in number 2 above, is the pervasive primary influence in the universe. God is communicating God's will at every moment to every energy event in the universe, seeking to persuade it in a certain direction. But God does not have deterministic power. The rest of creation reserves the right, to some degree, to do its own thing, and therefore to frustrate God's will. 3, our own self-awareness helps us explain this concept. This was the point I was just making, that we are influenced in our own selves by the past, by God, and then finally we decide what we're going to do with our lives. We may want to blame someone else, but we do finally decide. And that's an example of how, in a limited degree, every energy event functions in Whitehead's view. Point D, I find Whitehead's view helpful because of the way it addresses some serious issues of life and faith. Excuse me. 1, it makes sense out of the long evolutionary process and dead ends within it. Before I dealt with Whitehead, evolution was very troubling to me. I believed it was the way creation came about. But I kept asking, why so long if God is all-powerful? And this makes sense of it in Whitehead, that God has to persuade it to come forward. 2, natural evil can be understood, earthquakes, floods, so forth, can be understood as the result of physical activity not fully under the influence of God's persuasion. I mean, it's one thing to say that God pulls back some of God's power to allow us freedom. But why does God pull back God's power and allow hurricanes and massive earthquakes? Why doesn't God at least stop those? Whitehead's understanding would be God does not have total control over all those physical factors that are going on. 3, human evil is a result of our inherent freedom, and while God resists it, God cannot block it if we insist. 4, this view reinforces our feeling of freedom and sense of responsibility for others in the world. This is one of the things I appreciate about process theology. This freedom in every energy event, it is a reminder to us we do have freedom to make decisions and to do something with our lives. That between every event there's this break and we can begin to change. That change, you know, say we've got a terrible habit. We may not be able to change it overnight, but we can begin to work on it because there's a split here every time that gives us a new chance to move in a new direction, at least slowly to begin to shift our life. For instance, we may be flaming with anger and we're going to smash everything if we're not careful. We don't have to do that. We are free because there's a break and a new chance at every point. We are free to begin to modify that immediately and to move in another direction if we make the decision to do that. So Whitehead's thinking undergirds the freedom we have instead of taking it away. Too often, concepts of God have denied or minimized our freedom. This view maximizes it, which I think is true, that we do have that kind of freedom if we choose to use it. 5, it envisions God as being intimately involved in every event at every moment. God is with us and our struggles. 6, it gives power to the cross as a sign pointing to a suffering God, deeply involved in the struggle for a decent tomorrow and constantly being nailed to the cross by our hate, our insensitivity, our nationalism, and so forth. That is, the suffering love revealed in Jesus directly points to the suffering love of God as God seeks to persuade reality onward toward a new day and endures much rejection and failure in the process. And then B, love is authentic when it stands with us and is willing to suffer in the process. The cross points to that kind of divine love, and this concept of God possessing limited power or a different kind of power than we have thought of traditionally reinforces the message of the cross. Any comments on that? Thoughts, questions? Jim?
I would like to get your personal view of what happens to us after we die and leave the earth.
I sort of feel like Reinhold Niebuhr, who I mentioned earlier, who at one point said that he could not describe the temperature of hell or the furniture of heaven. And I'm to the point in my own personal faith of simply saying that I'm in the hands of God and I trust God. And I do believe in the survival beyond this life, that this energy event that is the I-ness can survive the brain, and I leave it up to God what that means. And that's the best I can do. But it's enough for me in terms of my own personal faith. And we just don't have the evidence beyond that. But I trust the love of God in that. Ellen?
How did Whitehead deal with things like the parting of the Red Sea?
The parting of the Red Sea, he would have, I don't think he probably dealt with it, but he would probably have said that was a story that sort of got built up over time. I doubt if he would have believed it exactly in the form it appeared in Exodus. But many biblical scholars question it as well. whether it was exactly the way it's reported there.
Yeah, I thought that they found a shelf underneath the Red Sea where when certain winds came, it would move the water over the shelf.
Well, yeah, there may be an explanation along those lines as well. That's true. That some natural events may have made that possible, and that later they understood it was God, which still would not deny the fact that God may well have been calling his people to come forward and to come out of slavery. But Whitehead, I don't recall ever seeing where he directly commented on it, but I'm guessing he would have said something like that.
My point was this lack of power.
Uh-huh.
The lack of God's power that he indicates.
Yeah. Would.
Well, so far his thinking indicates that God didn't have a whole lot of power.
Well, yeah, God does have a whole lot of power, but it's not total power. It is different than we've usually thought of, but in Whitehead's view, to be in contact with every energy event in the universe, persuading it and moving creation as far as we have moved, is a sign of considerable power, but it is different than what we've usually said. Let me read you an article which sums up this whole thing. It was written by Bob Brizee, who is a United Methodist pastor in Washington State. He is a pastoral counselor. And he wrote a book a few years ago called Where in the World is God? And it is written from the process perspective. And this is an article that was part of that book. Actually, it was written before he wrote the book. And but most of it ended up in that book. And I want to read this little story because it brings home this view of how God works, and in a way that I think is easier to grasp than what we've been doing so far. So let me read it. Tom sat in his senior English class, his thoughts occasionally drifting from the discussion. During one of the daydreams, it occurred to him he'd enjoy having lunch with Cindy at a drive-in. This particular idea emerged as one of God's enticing possibilities for Tom. It represents God's continuing desire that Tom have intense and satisfying experiences. The thought pleased Tom as he turned it over in his mind, savoring all the enjoyment of the daydream. Between classes, he found Cindy. He suggested the plan for lunch. She liked it too. God was present with both Cindy and Tom, feeling the anticipation with them as they planned together. Since Cindy needed to stop at our house to pick up her pom-poms for drill team practice that afternoon, she would drive and meet Tom there. The final class of the morning seemed to creep up on Tom in spite of God's lure that he might become involved in the history of constructing the wondrous Grand Coulee Dam in his classroom. Ignoring this possibility, Tom divided his attention between thinking about Cindy and gazing out the window at the apple trees that were beginning to bud. The lunch bell jolted Tom from his revelry. He scooped up his books from the desk and fairly flew out the door. God, being a part of Tom's soul, that is, feeding into Tom's soul, felt the excitement. The key was fit into the ignition, the throttle opened, and with two firm thrusts to his foot, the cycle started. Tom loved the surge of power he always felt when the engine roared. God felt that surge right along with Tom. Kicking up the stand, Tom turned the accelerator on the handle, held on the brakes, and literally burned rubber out of the parking lot. It seemed to him that it was the only place during his day where he had some freedom to be himself. All day he was told what to do. This paper is due, that assignment, this class, so forth. God lured Tom to enjoy the day about him, to drink in the emerging beauty, to see the vivid colors, to feel the warmth of the spring sun on his shoulders. Tom was torn between enjoying the present and anticipating what was next. God was enjoying this experience with Tom, as well as with the many entities that were present in the scene. God was relating to the birds singing on the branches, the newly formed buds on the apple tree, the nitrogen in the soil, the dog lying lazily in the sun. Yet with Tom, God experienced enjoyment in a more full and intense way. God was the most complex being in this picture. God promoted an awareness in Tom that he did not have his helmet on. In fact, by the wind whipping through his hair, Tom did remember that it was still in his locker. Among the array of possibilities that God offered to Tom, the most prevalent in this moment was to return to school for his helmet. Safety was the nature of this lure. For a fleeting moment, Tom considered but quickly shook off the idea. It was too much bother. It would take him away from his short lunch with Cindy. The most lurking danger, however, was that Mr. Simpson might be waiting for him to talk to him about burning rubber in the parking lot. Tom returned his attention to the free and easy feeling of a young man on his bike on a beautiful day. He had driven this road between school and town so many times he could do it blindfold. He knew the road by its feel, every bump, pothole, curve, straightaway. Tom could feel the curve ahead long before he arrived. He enjoyed the tingling feeling he felt as he leaned into the curve, a reminder of the rides at a carnival. God felt the excitement and tingling along with Tom. God offered to Tom the possibility that caution be highlighted on this curve. Let up on the hand throttle and lightly touch the brakes in nearing the curve. Tom was in no mood for caution. Today was a day of risk-taking. Tom gunned it. Seconds later, Tom felt the bike begin to slide. God, feeling this experience simultaneously with Tom, sent a rapid series of messages, much like the red alert to a pilot crew. Let up on the gas, hang on, straighten out the wheel, keep your balance, stay upright. With computer-like speed, Tom processed these messages, as well as those coming from the sensory outposts of his own body. Yet all messages seemed to be of no avail. Tom was losing control fast. Tires no longer gripped the surface of the road. God felt this loss of control in Tom's body just as he did. Although God's lure was to loosen, Tom instinctively tightened every muscle. Adrenaline surged through his system, his heart pounded, blood vessels in his arms and legs contracted. God, while relating to the various combination of molecules that make up rubber tires, asphalt highway, gravel, chrome, and steel, also offered possibilities to each of these entities. None of them, however, had the influence to change the course of events, which were already in progress. The decision of a highly complex soul, of which God is a persuasive part, had set machine into motion with great speed, traveling over earth, asphalt, and gravel. Over the steep bank at the curve, machine and person were airborne. Loose gravel, flying sparks, a cloud of dust. The consequences of earlier decisions were now being enacted. God continued to offer possibilities. Loosen muscles, stay with the bike, breathe deeply. God felt with Tom the shudder of utter terror as he flew into the air. God experienced with Tom the scream as he sighted the large tree directly in his pathway. A sense of utter helplessness surged through Tom as he realized the impossibility of changing directions. It was a violent crunch, excruciating pain, intense burning sensation, flesh ripping, blood flowing, a starburst, visual memories in rapid succession, then blackness, and no feeling. God feels the utter shattering along with Tom. God experiences no response to rapid-fire lures. Tom's soul is rapidly depleted, as though a riot has occurred. God shifts the possibilities from the highly complex soul to the level of Tom's body system. Pulsating messages are offered to Tom like the messages sent in Morse code. Contract vessels in the extremities, clot the flowing blood, establish heartbeat, breathe rhythmically, develop the central control of consciousness. Even from the body systems, there is no response. There remains no central coordination. The trauma experienced was too extensive. Neither Tom's soul nor his physical being could take it in and deal with it. There was too much damage. The insult to his total system was too great. Along with Tom, God felt the blackness and the loss of feeling. Tom died. Every experience Tom had been through, God had felt with him in fullness and completeness. The entire series of experiences which had been Tom were now saved in the divine experience of God. God and Tom begin a new adventure in some mysterious new form. I appreciate that article because it helps to bring home more on a human level what Whitehead's talking about. And this gets at it, that at every moment, God is involved with us. and sending a signal to us, an initial aim. And at every moment, we've got the freedom to do something about that and the past that's influencing us. And we may go in ways God does not want, but that at every moment, God is luring us, calling us toward life and beauty. And sometimes is defeated in that process, and sometimes succeeds. Any comments on any of that? Jim?
What's interesting about this to me is that, in my own view, religion has to meet some test of logic. I have to be able to reconcile what I see as God with what I see around me, and how events take shape around me. And I firmly believe that the knowledge that we gain is knowledge that we were willed to have. In fact, I mean, we've been given the ability to think. And yet, when you pursue, and this does meet the test of logic, it's very interesting in that regard. And yet, when I try to bend my mind to this, I feel like I'm leaving home for the first time. I feel like I'm leaving something secure over there.
That's right.
Because all of a sudden, God isn't taking care of things for me.
It is a major shift in thinking. Yeah, that's true. But the other point is why, again, I've been was drawn to Whitehead in South Stockton in my ministry, that his thinking for me illuminated the reality I saw around me, the suffering, the tragedy. Where was God in that? God was struggling to pull it out of it, not creating that mess. God did not confound that reality or confuse it for me. He clarified it, gave me a sense of what was going on. But it is a big shift away from some traditional thinking. But again, I would remind you that it also affirms some strong traditional points, that we do have freedom, that God is involved in our lives, something that has been a confusing issue in the 20th century. Prayer makes sense in this case, in terms of being open, developing a prayer discipline that allows God's initial aim to reach us so we hear it and sense what it means and move with it. The more spiritual we become, the more capable we are of picking up the signal of what God wants of us at every given moment. That God is truly a being, a loving being, who is involved in all creation. Those are all historic documents, convictions of the church, and this view comes around in a rather radical way to undergirding those views, which is why it was so powerful in my life, and still is down through the years. But it's controversial, and as I said at the start, some of you will like it, some of you will decide it's crazy, but that either way, it does push you to think through where you are. You know what I mean? You struggle with this for a while, and you have to think through where you are if you're not here. And that's one of its advantages, because we tend too often not to do that in our faith journeys. Any other thoughts tonight? We won't. Yeah, Audrey?
This may not be the time when you want to bring it up, sometime during this date. I don't know if Whitehead deals with the evil energy or the evil spirit, or if he doesn't, I'd like sometime for you to express your thoughts on that.
Whitehead did not believe there was an evil power such as Satan moving through creation. He did not believe that. What he did understand was that there is this freedom in creation to move against God, which at the human level, as I usually define in my sermons, is excessive self-concern, is the destructive thing that takes over, and that can become malignant. I mean, it can create more of it in other people. Nazi Germany is an example, where Hitler's excessive self-concern became a malignancy that infected the whole nation. And so that a whole nation became evil. But it was because of its, in Whitehead's thought, of the inherent freedom that finally we have to make a hell on earth, and not because of a Satan who influenced Hitler. So Whitehead would come out on that side. But we'll talk more about those kind of things as we get further into it. Are there any other thoughts? Any questions? Or
Could
yes?
God be applied in another religion like Islam, like Allah, or how would that work?
Well, you would have to ponder it within the context of that religion. There's our scholar, Eldridge Trott. There are, and I'm no scholar on Buddhism, but there are some parallels in Whitehead's thought with Buddhism, some points of contact where Buddhist scholars have, for instance, with Dr. Cobb, been in some serious dialogue about Whitehead's understanding and how it affects both Buddhism and Christianity and Judaism. So there are some points of contact. I'm not an authority on all of that, and I can't say very much about it. But there are people in variety of religions who are looking at Whitehead and pondering him. So I think a lot of that remains to be unfolded in the future. Any other thoughts before we move to a close tonight? As I said, we'll go back over this in different ways each session, and it will take on a little more richness or logic, I hope, as we do that. I wanted to conclude with a meditation that was in the magazine Alive Now a number of years ago, and it goes like this. God's creation represents a tremendous investment in me. For 4.5 billion years, many trillions of events occurred on Earth in such a way that here and now I am possible. Some of these events were large ones, like the accumulation of atmosphere. Some were small, like the chain of matings that stretched back from me through billions of links to the origin of life. My existence is the current fruit of billions of lifetimes that successfully continued God's creation until here and now God also moves through me. I meditate on this when I think my life is going wrong. Amen. Thank you.